Hi everyone, welcome to this fourth webinar. We are waiting a few minutes for more participants to join us. Thank you for being here with us. Hi Rabeea, no, the presentation has not started yet. We are waiting a few minutes for participants to join. We'll be starting in a short moment. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Nathalie.
Hi Rabeea, welcome.
Thanks.
So I think we're now ready to start. So thank you everyone for joining that fourth webinar of the series jointly organized by CaLP and the World Food Programme. Thank you for those among you who attended the previous webinars. For those who missed them, you can find the recordings and the Q&A document coming with each webinar on CaLP webpage on our website. Throughout the webinar, as usual, we encourage you to use the Q&A section to ask your questions to the presenters and to save the chat for things related to IT or so we can make sure that we track your question and address them. As usual, if we cannot, and it's likely that we won't be able to address all of your questions during the time of the webinar, we'll compile all of them in a Q&A document that will be shared along with the recording next week. I'd like to introduce all of our panelists today. So we are touching on a topic that we know has been a huge challenge for most field practitioners and for cash working groups across the world. So it's how to convert the MEB into a transfer value for MPC, because yes, MEB and transfer value are two different things. And this is what we will be starting with Nynne Warring, that you know very well. She's been with us since the beginning for WFP HQ. We are joined today by Rabeea Ahmed, who is a senior cash advisor interagency for CAP, currently deployed to Yemen to support the cash and markets working group with OCHA. Thank you, Rabeea, for being here. We are also with Marianne, who is a food thematic expert for Central Africa and the cash focal point for the region, based in Yaoundé, Cameroon, with DG ECO. Thank you very much, Marianne. And we are joined today by Max Seilern, who is a program officer for Ground Truth Solution, who is doing fantastic work in assessing the recipients' perspectives on cash assistance. He works mostly on the cash barometer that I hope many of you have heard of. It's an initiative that is an independent accountability mechanism for CVA across different contexts. We had tested it on some locations in West and Central Africa, and I'm sure you've heard about it too. So thank you very much, Max, for being here. Without further ado, because we have a lot to talk about today, I will hand over to Nynne for the setting the scene and framing the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Nathalie. So I'm just gonna right up front disappoint everybody and tell you that in the next slides, I'm not gonna give you the magic key to how you set a transfer value based on an MEB for multi-purpose cash transfers. So if that was what you were hoping for, then I think we'll have to wait a few years until we have figured that magic bullet out. But what we will do is to try and give a few concepts and a few ideas to spur your thinking, and then we will see some field examples and we'll have some inputs from our guest speakers today. All of this is meant to get concepts straight, but also to get you inspired for when you are designing your transfer programs. So just a few kind of slides to get us all on the same page. I'm not going to go through this one. Nathalie has already told us that this is a webinar in a series of many. It's not the first, it's the fourth. And please use the Q&A during the session if you want to ask a question. We already know this. Now, what we do in each of these webinars is to just make sure that we're always starting from the same fundamental understanding. Since we are always talking about minimum expenditure baskets, we like to just post for you the definition once again, just to make sure that we all have it fresh in the backs of our minds. So you can read it here on the screen. The MEB is defined what the household requires to meet basic or essential needs on a regular seasonal basis and its costs. If you want to know more about this, we have the recordings and the Q&As from the previous webinars where we've gone into quite a lot of detail on what this means and different topics related on how we construct the MEB. We're not going to go much more into this today. Just to kind of re-emphasize that the MEB is requiring, of course, identifying what are these basic or essential needs that people need and that they buy. Things that can be accessed, items, goods or services that can be monetized and accessed through the local market in adequate quantity and quality. Yeah. Of course, as we've also been talking extensively about, an MEB is inherently multisectoral. It contains all of those basic needs that the household needs. And it contains those needs that you're covering in the market. That's also going to be important for today's discussion. The MEB is not everything under the sun. The MEB are those needs that are covered fully or partially through the market. Okay. That's a starting point. That's the MEB. So with that established, and the reason why a lot of us are even establishing these MEBs in the first place is because we want to know how much should we transfer to a household in a cash transfer program. So before we go into a little bit of the technicalities of how we may do that, just to get another couple of concepts straight today, when we talk about the transfer value broadly, we talk about the net monetary amount that we are transferring to beneficiaries as cash, sometimes as vouchers, to help them meet their needs. I don't think this definition here comes as a surprise to anybody, but just so that we are all on the same page. We're also specifically today focusing our discussion on multi-purpose cash transfers. And so we've also put it up a definition of multi-purpose cash here. It's something that also often spurs a lot of discussion. You can read it here. Multi-purpose cash transfers are those transfers that correspond to the amount of money that are required to cover in full or partially a household's basic and or recovery needs. Okay, so those are the two concepts that we're looking at today: transfer value for multi-purpose cash. Okay. All right. I tend to speak fast, so if I'm speaking too fast, please put it in the chat. Well, we have a lot to get through, so okay. So we have the MEB, we have the concept of transfer value and multi-purpose cash. How do we go from one to the other? The very first thing to note, and we've said this before, Nathalie said it in the introduction, I think by now it's probably clear to everyone, the MEB is not the same as the transfer value. Once we have found this monetary threshold that the MEB gives us for how much it costs to cover your essential needs on a monthly basis, typically, it's tempting to just run with it and use that as a transfer value. However, it is not the same as the transfer value. Why is that? Well, the MEB is this threshold that we can align to, but because most people always have some sort of resources or abilities of their own, the MEB in its totality would not make up our transfer value. However, we can use it to find out, comparing it to how much people can actually cover by themselves, we can use it to find out how far they are from actually being able to cover their needs. This is what we call a gap analysis. And I'll spend a couple of slides just explaining what we mean by that. However, and there's one more caveat, the gap analysis does not also necessarily need to translate into the final transfer value. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But what the picture we want to give you here is that we're starting from the MEB. This is our starting point. We've already spent time talking about how we establish that. And then we can use that to do a gap analysis, and we can then use that gap to understand how much should we actually transfer to households in order to help them meet their needs in a multi-purpose cash program. Okay, so I have a couple of pictures. They're quite simplistic, but I think they help tell the story. So the analytical starting point we've already talked about is, of course, the MEB. So now we want to do a gap analysis. So what does that really mean? So here, very simplistically, think about the green line as our MEB, and this blue-green bar graph here is what people can themselves cover for their different needs. And the gap is then very simply the distance between the MEB and what they cover themselves. That's the gap in their needs, if you will, in monetary terms. So a gap analysis tells us how far people are away from being able to meet their needs. So we compare a household's own economic capacity to the MEB. I am not going to go into detail. There are different ways that you can then establish this. One of the often used methods is to look at expenditure data of the households that you want to target with your transfer. That's something we can expand upon in the Q&A, but there are different ways to kind of get there. The most important thing to show today is just that that's basically what you want to establish is households' own economic capacity as compared to the MEB. So that's the first picture. I have another picture that I think also explains it a little bit. So just to sort of recap, the MEB is the red line here. Think of it as our line, our threshold that we want to bring people up to, our basic or essential needs thresholds. You can then establish whether a household is above that threshold or if it's below it. If it's below it, those are usually the people that we want to help with our assistance. And then the gap analysis then tells us how far people are away. And I've put two green little buckets here, and that's because the point here is that a gap analysis ultimately depends on who you're calculating this gap for. If you have an MEB threshold of, I don't know, $200 for a household in a month, you will find a lot of households, presumably, who won't be able to meet that. But how you calculate that gap and the size of that gap will depend on which of those households who can't meet their needs that you want to target with your assistance. It may not be everybody below that line. It could be the poorest of those below the line. They would have a larger gap than if you take the average of everybody below that line. Just putting this here because sometimes when you say gap analysis, if we look at the previous picture, it seems quite simple. But of course, whenever we talk about something in broad terms like a gap analysis, the devil is in the detail, in the sense that how you calculate that gap really depends on also for whom you calculate that gap and what that gap ultimately tells you. Okay, that's a lot of technical detail. I think the most overarching point that we want to leave you with here is that the MEB is your threshold, the gap analysis you do for those households that you want to support, and you find out how far away they are, because that would be, let's say, ideally what you would need to give people in order to make them cover their needs. Okay, all right, so we did the gap analysis. Excellent, we just showed you how to do it. We're done, right? That's what we should be giving people. Well, it's obviously the starting point. It's the basis. It helps you understand how far away these people are from meeting their needs. I've said that maybe 15 times already, so I think you get the point. But the thing is, this gap analysis is just the beginning. It's just kind of the first step that you need to take in order to get to your transfer value. Why is that? I'm going to show you a slide with a lot of text on. So when we talk about transfer values, it's really just one amongst many of the design parameters that you have to think about once you design your intervention or your program. There is, as a starting point here, the value, monetary terms, think of it as a dollar value or shillings value or whatever currency you're dealing in. That's your gap, that's your monetary gap for those households you're interested in. However, you also need to know, like, who is it that you're targeting, right? How long are you going to provide these people with assistance? Is it a 3-month transfer? Is it a year? Is it multiple years? How often are you going to give the transfer? Is it a monthly transfer, just like the MEB often is a monthly calculation, or do you give it more frequently or less frequently? Do you think of tiering your transfer? So for instance, you provide a basic transfer for most households, but for certain households with specific needs, you provide a top-up. Or in certain seasons, you provide a top-up when it's particularly cold or their needs because of planting season coming up. What about household size? Something we didn't really go into very much in the MEB calculation part of this webinar series, but that's something that there's also quite a lot of guidance and materials on there out there. Do you do proportional transfers, meaning that the transfer increases proportionate to household size, or do you need to take economies of scale into consideration? Also a really important design parameter. And last but definitely not least, is there anything else that you need to do in order to make your program effective? Is it enough to give people a household transfer, give them some money every month, or however frequently you do it? Or do you also need to work on the supply side, for instance? Or do you need to do behavioral change communication? Like, whatever else do you need to do to make your program work the way you intend it to work? All those are things that are key for you to consider. And the transfer value is just one of those parameters, but it's influenced by how you're setting all these other parameters. So you can't set it in isolation from all these other considerations. Now, then how do you go about finding out all of that? That is obviously also influenced by a whole range of factors. I would say absolutely overall, the program objective is what this always boils down to. What is it that you're trying to achieve? Are you trying to get all households up to a basic needs minimum and that's it, just multi-purpose cash? Or are you trying to achieve on top of that, let's say, a particular nutrition outcome? Or are you trying to, do you have a gender objective in your program? There could be a whole host of factors that you would need to also think about and need to adapt your design parameters in order to achieve that. Other things, beneficiary preferences. What is that? What do they look like? What is your funding availability? You can have the best and most well-designed program in the world, but if you can't fund it, you might need to think a little bit differently about how those parameters are being set. What is everybody else doing? Are people already receiving assistance from other agencies in kind or cash, or what does that look like? And should you harmonize with other agencies? What's the case for that? How can you do it? What does that imply for the transfer that you can make? What about programs that are not necessarily in the humanitarian sphere, but are still relevant to the populations that we're looking at, in particular safety nets? What are they transferring? Are we looking at some of populations that are adjacent or overlapping? And what does that mean? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the reason why we put all this here is not really to frustrate you, but to make you think of this transfer value decision as one really, really key design parameters, but still one amongst a host of other factors. And always come back to what is it that you're trying to achieve with your program and start from that. Okay. Just a couple of more slides. and considerations to have, and that we hope you will also maybe reflect on in the Q&A as we're going through the subsequent presentations. Again, first of all, always keep in mind, how can you achieve your program objective? What other design features, in addition to the transfer value, do you need to have? There are some examples here. Another one that I indirectly touched on before, related of course to funding and also to your targeting strategy. If you don't have enough money to cover the ideal transfer value for all of the households that you would really like to target, do you then give more to, like, do you give a big amount to a fewer amount to fewer people, or do you give a smaller amount to as many people as you would like to target? What's the trade-off? How do you make that decision? Social safety net, I've already mentioned this. And then another point, and I think we will have, we will touch on that in the interventions later today. How do we link whatever it is that we end up transferring and how we end up designing our program to outcome monitoring, feedback from beneficiaries, etc. Okay, lots of food for thought, not a whole lot of solutions. We have, let's say, the technical tools on the gap analysis side, but a lot of these other parameters really comes down to the kind of critical thinking that you do in your program design. I have one last slide that we wanted to add here, because today we're also looking a little bit at this. So what if what you have is not an MEB, but an SMEB? And you probably recall from, I think, our first webinar, we touched a little bit on what is this. The SMEB is not always understood exactly in the same way, but the basic definition of it is that it's the absolute survival minimum amount that you need to maintain existence and cover life-saving needs. So it is, in practical terms, a lower or cheaper threshold than the MEB. In some contexts, this is what has been designed in SMEB. Can you use that to set a transfer value? Yes, you can, but of course you need to know that if you are using an SMEB, and you're devising your gap analysis or bringing people up to that level, they will be able to cover their life-saving needs, which is not necessarily the same as all of their basic needs. So of course you can relate a transfer value to a lower threshold, but that just has implications for what your ultimate programming look like. I put here gap analysis and SMEB question mark. In some cases, and I'm not sure if this is being applied very consistently though, but if you do not have anything else and you don't do a gap analysis, sometimes the SMEB is applied directly as a transfer value in the lieu of being able to do a gap analysis as a quick fix until you can get an MEB established and a proper gap analysis. Again, this is being done differently in different contexts. So just to put it here, the SMEB is also a concept that is in the mix of things. It's a lower threshold. Bringing people up to a lower threshold, of course, has another implication for the outcomes that you can achieve with your program, but it's definitely something that is being done. All right. So I hope I hope you're not completely out of breath like I am already. That was a lot of dense information in a short span of time, but I'm going to stop here. And then we can definitely take questions and comments and all of that in the chat. We were very happy to discuss all of what was has just been said with you. I'm going to now hand it over to Rabeea from the Yemen cash working group, who will show us an example from that cash working group. All right. Over to you, Rabeea.
Thank you very much. And may I request if I can get control of the presentation? If not, then you'll have to support me with that.
I'll just forward it for you. Don't worry. Just let me know.
Okay, so we move to the first slide, and can we please move to yes. So if you see the little guy in the corner, we actually start like that. It was quite some discussions and deliberations before we actually started off working with MEB and SMEB. And in the start, there were quite some questions whether we do MEB or SMEB. And the discussions then started off with the moving ahead. And Nynne, if you can just click on all the animations and make the whole slide visible, please. Yes. So the SMEB discussions for Yemen actually started off in late 2017. And then when we started off those discussions back then, there were quite some discussions that whether we go directly and just agree upon as a cash market working group with amounts, and the corresponding commodities and things like that. So when the discussions initiated at that particular time, it was quite bare minimum that was agreed upon in the list of commodities, and the transfer values were set. And then in January 18, the first ever SMEB was approved for Yemen, and the transfer value corresponding to the list of commodities were Yemeni Riyal 52,000. And then later in 2018, again, there was an increase in commodity prices, and then this actually led to the revision of SMEB again. And then in November 2018, the transfer value was again set to 73,000 Yemeni Riyal. But then again, there were a bit of differences because a lot of programs were already ongoing and people were not comfortable changing the assistance package in the middle of the programs. And then there were some already agreed proposals with the donor. So again, changing the transfer value at that particular time was not practical. So there was a bit of disconnect. And then in May 2019, the inflation continued to rise in Yemen, and then it again led to the revision of SMEB and transfer values. And there were also discussion whether we need to add some additional commodities in the SMEB. And by then the transfer value was reduced slightly to 65,000 Yemeni Riyal in May 2019. Then again, we saw abnormal fluctuations in the currency exchange rates and also in the commodity prices in the markets in late 2019. And everything plus COVID actually had some compound effects on the country's economy, which led to the increase in prices of the commodities. So again, this revision of SMEB was initiated. Then finally in 2020 September, we agreed upon the list of commodities, and then the transfer value was set. There were two different transfer values were set for North and South. And why these were set, you will see in the next slides of the presentation. Next slide, please. So you see here, we had a very complicated logic applied. And if I may request, if you can just click on the slide again. Yes, please go ahead. So we consulted all the lead clusters. We consulted FSAC, Shelter NFI, WASH, Health and Services. And then based on the consultations, we actually got some very bare minimum critical list of commodities. There may be a question why we went for a survival minimum expenditure basket rather than a minimum expenditure basket. Because Yemen is a very compound critical situation, and we needed to have some life-saving assistance package out ASAP, even though we were not able to do it as we planned because of the certain negotiations and discussions among the clusters and some cash market working group members. But eventually we were able to come up to a consensus, and then we were able to finalize the list of commodities through the consultations, which also included the services. If you see in the list of items, we got the minimum food basket items from FSAC, which is the Food Security and Agriculture cluster. We got Shelter NFI lump sum. Why lump sum? Because we were not able to get an agreement on the critical Shelter NFI items. Why? Because there are different needs in off-camp setting, on-camp setting, and then one-off basket and multiple times basket. So we agreed upon a bare minimum lump sum amount. Then again, we got a clear list of commodities from WASH team. Similarly, we have to agree upon a lump sum for health. Why? Again, because it is very difficult to just put a finger on the health needs of a certain household. So we just agreed upon a lump sum. And then we put some amount for transportation and communication as well. So once the list of commodities were finalized, the SMEB itself was finalized, and then we discussed upon how to quantify or monetize the commodities. So we went back to the clusters again, and the clusters provided us with the corresponding cost of each of the item they provided us for the SMEB. So the transfer values were based upon the SMEB items. the transfer value was for the north was set to be 45,000 Yemeni Riyal for a minimum food basket because of the highly fluctuating food basket rates or food commodities rates in north versus south. And then rest of the commodity costs were actually standard. For south, as I told you earlier, that there is a very high currency exchange fluctuation in Yemen, which tends to be on a higher side towards the southern part or the southern governorates of the country. So it was agreed that we apply a 15% contingency buffer across board to NFI and services cost, because similar was also applied to the food basket costs, which were given to us by the FSAC. Why we use 15% for rest of the commodities? It was not that we just followed blindly the percentage applied by the food security and agriculture cluster. We actually did a comprehensive analysis of the commodity prices, and we monitored the prices from quite some time back in a couple of years, but then we used the January 2020 cost as the baseline values, and then we calculated and we compared the percentage differences across the months until September. The percentage differences actually ranged from 9% to 30%. And then eventually we agreed upon a percentage buffer of 15 across board. And then so that we have a harmonized percentage buffer applied for the south value. Next slide, please. So this on your screen is the SMEB based transfer value for north. And if you see, there is also a column which says price monitoring. So we are monitoring the prices of each commodity through various different sources. And the Cash and Market Working Group Yemen actually aims to harmonize this monitoring as well. And if you see that each commodity has, if there is a rounding of value, then the totals actually correspond to the actual rounded off value. So in the total, in the end, if you see the total agreed amount, the transfer value for north is 101,000 Yemeni Riyal. Next slide, please. After applying the percentage buffer, that was 15% contingency buffer, as I shared earlier, the value for south becomes 117,000 Yemeni Riyal. So all these commodities are fixed. The quantity per family is fixed. The only difference is the percentage buffer because of the fluctuating currency exchange rates. Next slide, please. So what the recommendations we gave as a Cash and Market Working Group was that, as shared earlier, the transfer values for north and south are 101,000 Yemeni Riyal and 117,000 Yemeni Riyal respectively. The threshold of 95% has been recommended to initiate the process of revision. However, the Cash and Market Working Group may call an ad hoc meeting for the SMEB Technical Working Group, which is a sub-working group of the Cash and Market Working Group, based on any abnormal market price fluctuation. And if you see that for now, the Cash and Market Working Group has recommended 2 separate transfer values for north and south, which are not recommended in the general situation. But because the context of Yemen is so fluid and so dynamic, we had to agree upon these 2 different transfer values. However, the moment the situation stabilizes, the Cash and Market Working Group will call a meeting and we will agree upon one SMEB and one SMEB based transfer value across the country in all regions. Another recommendation which we gave as a Cash and Market Working Group was that all the ongoing projects will continue to use the preset transfer values to avoid any confusion and issues regarding the implementation of planning and replanning of projects, to avoid the confusion and to avoid the issues within the organizations and with the donors as well. And then it was recommended that all the organizations planning new CBA projects, they should use the new set transfer values. Next slide, please. Okay, so the cost of the SMEB commodities will be monitored for 3 consecutive months, and the Technical Working Group on Survival Minimum Expenditure Basket meeting, that will be called for deliberation every 3 months to evaluate the situation. Why every 3 months? Because we want to monitor the situation, and then we can agree or disagree whether to keep this MEB as two different bifurcated values for the regions, or we need to converge them and put a single value. And as mentioned in the previous slide, if the 95% threshold buffer has been breached, then we will call a meeting to initiate the revision of transfer values. Either way, whether the situation worsens or the situation stabilizes, in both ways we can call a meeting. And then again, firstly, the moment we agreed upon the transfer values, the next thing that was done was to devise a decision memo, and that decision memo was circulated. And a detailed guidance note has been developed and shared, and it is also available on humanitarian.info, so that it gives a more detail on how the commodities were selected, whether a gap analysis was done or not. It tells you that how each cluster actually gave us the commodities lists and the corresponding values, and how these transfer values can be used to construct or set the MPCA assistance package value. So the guidance note actually is the detailed note or detailed document which guides the cash and market actors in Yemen how to use this survival minimum expenditure basket. Next slide.
That's your last slide.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabeea. So we can already see in the comments chat and the Q&A that there are some debates around the SMEB and the MEB, which were expected. We want to focus today really on the MEB to transfer value, but maybe just one word from you, Rabeea. What makes your work a SMEB rather than an MEB? Because as discussed, and the SMEB, it's fully okay, as Nynne also said, to go beyond food. It's not necessarily just food. So the difference between the SMEB and the MEB is probably the level of depth and range of needs that each covers. But in your case, as Damien also is raising in the chat, the SMEB is quite high. So in just a few words, Rabeea, can you tell us why you consider this a survival minimum expenditure rather than MEB in this case? We can hear you, Rabeea. I don't know if you've muted.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I was on mute. Okay. So what I was just saying was that why we agreed upon the survival minimum expenditure basket, because we actually wanted to focus on very bare minimum critical needs. And there was also a debate whether this can be called a minimum expenditure basket because of the presence of additional items. But there is a certain logic that has been applied on the back end. If you see in the wash commodities, you can see the sanitary napkins. You can also see the water cost. But they were thinking whether to put the sanitary napkins or not, because then there is the human right-based approach towards the minimum expenditure basket, which means that we need to put additional items, which includes sanitary napkins and other things, rather than having the fixed survival cost. For us, we agreed upon that we needed these items because of the female hygiene part. Not only that, because the females are, and there is a limited access to water in Yemen. And because of the currency fluctuation in the country, we saw that how this currency fluctuation impacted on the key commodities in the market. And based on the very comprehensive analysis, we deduced that whenever there is a depreciation of the Yemeni real, it actually impacted on key commodities in food and in wash. And which commodity it impacted the most was in wash, it impacted on the water cost. And in food basket, it impacted upon the wheat flour cost.
Okay.
So we actually deliberated, and then we agreed upon these critical list of items, and then we had to agree upon the corresponding cost. The corresponding cost does not comes from a random speculation. It comes from a proper market survey and price monitoring. And then we were able to set the prices of the commodities.
Okay, thank you very much, Rabeea. I'm just conscious of time, so we can. It takes us back to some discussions we had before on how difficult it is to define a minimum and what basic essential needs are, and even when we specify survival needs, what is survival needs and what is the minimum needs? It's very difficult too. So we don't really want to take on this debate today because we really wanted to focus on the transfer value. And I will hand over to Marianne, whom I know also may have some reactions to Rabeea's presentation, and will share her insights on the MEB versus transfer value from her experience. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you, Nathalie, and thank you, Rabeea. Indeed, we see with your presentation, Rabeea, how it's difficult also to go beyond how usual way of delivering humanitarian assistance. And even if we are trying to move forward MEB, SMEB, still in the structure of designing those things, we are it's extremely difficult to go beyond, you know, this way of constructing things in another way than summing up sectoral things and items and needs, etc., etc. And then just two observations before starting my my presentation. Let's say. What is also surprising to me when I listen to you is the fact that apparently the SMEB and the transfer value were built together without this famous gap analysis that could imply different transfer values according to groups of population or according to the settings where people are living, etc. And another reaction associated to that is also the difficulty to have this MEB and or SMEB that is presented in terms of a package of essential needs and not automatically presented as a single value, monetarized value, which may vary a lot, once again, internally in the same intervention area and according to all the factors that were presented before by Nynne. So that was just the observation. Yeah, generally speaking, maybe we will have some times to, I don't know if we have time to discuss if you want to complete some things or not. Maybe we can take 2 minutes before entering in other perspective.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to add on that regarding the gap analysis, because we considered very much bare minimum critical items. So it was already a consensus among the clusters that these are the critical needs, and we cannot shrink them and we cannot expand them, because we could have added additional items, but that would have inflated the SMEB so much that it would have been difficult for the CVA actors to actually plan and design their programs because of the high cost and low outreach. As Nynne's presentation mentioned earlier, that it is a critical decision to decide and put or draw a line whether to assist less beneficiaries with more amount or more beneficiaries with less amount. So it was a critical decision. And then we had to decide whether to go ahead with the existing or with the finalized MEB, or wait again for additional 5 to 6 months to build a consensus within the clusters. So we thought that as part of the cash market working group, everybody unanimously agreed that we need to put things forward. And then because it's a critical list of items, we can go ahead with this list of items and the corresponding cost. And then if people want to use these lump sum transfer values and then design their MPCA, there are certain ways to do it. Rather take this transfer value as a lump sum for the MPCA package, or go with a thorough analysis and do a gap analysis, income analysis, and whole that economic household economic survey part, and then design the MPCA package, which takes more time. And with the context of Yemen, everything needs to be done like yesterday. So we agreed upon moving things forward and then graduate further on that. Over.
Okay, thank you, Rabeea. Should I continue?
Yes, please, Marianne.
Okay, so good afternoon to all. Actually, I'm not intending to broadcast the official DG ECO position and policy around MEB, transfer value, etc. Particularly because we are actually currently revising our policy. So the intention of this discussion and this exchange is more to try to share with you some of our thoughts, some of our observation based on our current experience, and mostly in my region, since I'm taking the lead on the discussion for the moment. But I know that some of my colleagues are also present to the call, so we may also be in a position to respond collectively if we have some large number of questions. So first of all, actually, we noticed that our partners tend to question more and more donors, generally speaking, to try to better understand what we are ready to support. Like, are we willing to support full MEB? Are we willing to support a certain transfer amount of money to the beneficiaries, etc., etc. We tend to think that actually it's not the donor who should be in a position to say to the partners, please do this for this beneficiary, and it will be the most appropriate response. No, clearly, what we are thinking internally is that, and I think it's common for other donors also, is the fact that we rely a lot on our partners to justify that what you are proposing for funding is actually the most appropriate response according to the level of gaps that your targeted population is going to face, and that we are going to deliver an amount that should enable those households to overcome their critical needs. This being said, we insist a lot internally to have our partners sharing a sound needs assessment, gap analysis, and also to share risk analysis, including protection. So this is, I would say, the kind of the requirements we are really going in deep, because we also think that it should help to justify that what we are doing is indeed the most appropriate response. The main challenges encountered as of now is maybe the fact that it seems there is no agreed definition on what is a gap analysis, how we are conducting it, and yeah, and how we can have like a harmonized and consensual approach in a certain area to have all partners agreeing on how we can conduct this gap analysis, how we can decide on how setting the transfer value according to all the factors that were presented previously by Nynne. What we think for the moment within ECO is that a gap analysis should enable us to better understand the difference between the needs, the essential needs, and the capacity of the household to cover those needs, either through their own self-coping mechanism and hopefully positive coping mechanisms, and the needs that could be covered by other things, other forms of assistance. Within ECO, we are supporting actually two different approaches. What we call the BNA, the Basic Need Approach, which consists in an assistance that is expected to cover a large range of basic needs. Often this is delivered through a single and repeated multipurpose cash transfer. And the second approach is more using cash as a way to deliver a sectoral assistance, also assuming somehow that the recipients would be somehow able to cover the other needs that would not be covered by this sectoral assistance. For both approaches, actually, what is extremely important for us is to make sure that the assistance will enable to improve and to reach outcomes. This is something that was maybe not discussed previously. And I think it's relevant for both approaches, be it sectoral outcomes if we are delivering a sectoral assistance, or if it is like overall outcomes that we are using when we deliver MPC. As far as ECHO is concerned, for the moment, we are encouraging our partners to use the 3 MPC outcome indicators that were agreed during the grand bargain. So there are like 2 cross-cutting indicators and 1 sectoral indicators according to the program. So just for me, it's really important to insist on that, because clearly it's not because we are doing, you know, MPC that we don't care if we are really involving a change for our recipients. We are not doing charity. We really want to make sure that the assistance we are delivering is going to imply a change within our recipients, and with the capacity to monitor measurable outcomes. And actually, this is very challenging for the moment, because as I said previously with Rabeea, it means that when we are delivering like MPC using MEBs, we are going to challenge all our sectoral indicators, because we have to monitor in a different way how we were able to improve the capacity of the household to cover their essential needs, generally speaking, not, you know, looking at very sectoral aspect. Actually, in West and Central Africa, the region where I'm working in, we have many difficulties to scale up for the moment the use of MEB for MPC, and notably because when we look at the population that would be below the MEB, we would be confronted to a large population that we will not be able to support, and also because most of the time, with the resources we have available, we are sometimes only able to support part of the essential needs, not because we are not recognizing that those people are confronted to lots of needs that they are not able to cover, but because we don't have the capacity to assist the same household with a large range of needs. So in the end, we are confronted to a situation where we don't really know how prioritizing between covering a large number of people with, let's say, just a sectoral assistance, full sectoral assistance, or if we are providing, let's say, more substantial assistance that is expected to cover maybe a bigger gaps, but for fewer people. So this is an issue we have, at least in my region, and also, so we are confronted to many different challenges also to scale up, and generally speaking, cash assistance. But what we observe is also the fact that sometimes we could deliver an appropriate response by combining modalities. And actually, it's extremely difficult for our partners to implement in the same time, in the same action, these mixed modalities, because it involves a lot of resources, yeah, generally speaking. So sometimes it's not easy for them to go in this direction, and it tends to revert back to, let's say, the usual way of delivering humanitarian assistance on a sectoral perspective rather than on a basic need approach. Another point I would like to mention is maybe the fact that when you talk about MEB, transfer value, etc., we think it is extremely important to strengthen coordination, not only between partners for example, we are supporting a lot in our regions cash working groups to agree on common methods, on having just one MEB per context, but having the possibility to have different transfer value according to level of gaps and according to population, etc. So for me, the importance is not just to focus on coordination between partners, but also to strengthen coordination at donors level and in line with the joint donor statement that was published some time ago. Because in any case, this is not something that should be decided just on a donor basis, but collectively and agreed in an harmonized way. In any case, what we tend to think internally is the fact that all this MEB process and all the process ongoing related to how defining transfer value is actually extremely useful also for advocacy purposes. We think that maybe it's a good way, even if it's just a tool and not the only possibility to define gaps and the level of assistance we want to deliver. It can be useful actually to better understand this depth of gaps and the fact that emergency assistance is quite unlikely to be the only way to fill this gap. So maybe it can be also useful to put more actors on the table and to see how we could link this part of the job carried out by humanitarian partners, for example, with social protection mechanisms, or how it could be useful also to implement the so-called nexus, also to see how we could co-fund some initiative to make sure that in the end, we will be able to implant significant change to our final recipients. Regarding the transfer value, an important point also to look at is maybe the fact that donors should not pay twice for the same beneficiaries for the same things. So we must be careful that, for example, if a partner is delivering an MPC, it may not cover some costs that would be supported by another donor or another partners for the same beneficiaries, but in a different way, like trying to improve access to services, or because we are delivering another sectoral response, etc. So this is just something that should be taken into account when we decide on the transfer value, to make sure that actually we are not paying double for the same things. And this is not easy also to define. So I'm sure that today we are especially focusing on how the MEB can be used to define the transfer value for an MPC. But just for you to know that we are also questioning if we could also use all this investment around MEB and gap analysis to also use an MEB to define the transfer value for a sectoral assistance. I'm taking the example in my region, for example, where, and this is related to my background, where the food needs are actually representing a big part of MEB. We may wonder if this is better to invest in all these MEB process, complex processes and so on, if in the end, we are just programming something that looks like food assistance response. We think that, for example, in places where we have like HEA outcome analysis available, maybe we could also use this kind of analysis to define the transfer value, in case, once again, that we are in a context where food and livelihood needs are representing the biggest parts of what was considered as the MEB. Another way could be also to question if how we could agree on a method that should enable to define which percentage of the MEB should enable to reach some sectoral outcomes. How we can make sure that with the package we are delivering to the cash that we are delivering to the recipients, they should be able to reach sectoral outcomes. Meaning that it's not because you just give like a food basket or an amount of money that looks like, oh, sorry. sorry. So I was saying that it's not because we just give like an amount of money that looks like a food basket plus a small top-up amount of money that we are sure that it will either reach food outcomes or, generally speaking, improve the coverage of the basic need of those populations. So that was somehow the question we have for the moment, but just to somehow conclude our thinking and so on, I think that it is important to recognize that donors, generally speaking, have a role to play, not only as being provider of public resources or private resources. Donors also have a role to play as enablers of those joint processes to make sure that in the end, we will have the capacity to cover the minimum basic needs of the most in needs and possibly even more than those basic needs. I think I can stop here and maybe make me available for questions and reactions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Marianne. I think you touched on many very important points and some that were raised also in the Q&A section. I take away the advocacy function of the MEB, the connection with the social safety nets that was also raised in the Q&A section, the comprehensive view of needs that is provided by the MEB, and that is really challenging the way we used to work. Complementarity of intervention, MPC is not a silver bullet, so we also have a few questions related to this in the Q&A. So because I'm conscious of time and I don't want to lose people before Max's presentation, so I just think that we have a few questions related to price monitoring that are really interesting. I will take one that summarizes a bit the others. Hugo in the chat, in the Q&A, is asking if there is any recommendation in regards to managing price fluctuations and significant geographic variation of prices. For instance, either having an absolute value set by a coordination body and, for instance, reevaluated every 3 months, like in Yemen, versus having a floating transfer value that would be informed by local prices based on a standardized underlying basket. I hand over to Nynne to address this one.
Okay, I'll try my best. It was interesting to see there are lots of questions coming up on price variations, both, let's say, sort of spatially, so within a country, but also over time, and what does that mean for your transfer value? I don't think that I will be able to give a recommendation for this, but maybe just some things to keep in mind. So if we think first of price fluctuations within a country, I would say that there is always a bit of a difference between monitoring prices, which one should always do on a basis that is kind of in line with how rapidly inflation is changing in the country that you're working in. Most of the places where you're working, it's monthly or maybe a little bit less frequent. Keeping an eye on the cost of the basket is one thing, and that should always be done. Whether or not that then triggers a change in the transfer value is another question. And one of the things that I would always at least warn against is that, or at least something that I have myself looked at in the past, to say, oh, we've seen a 10% increase or 15%, whatever threshold we've decided, increase in the cost of the basket. That means we need to change the transfer value accordingly. And then we do that. And then we realize the next month, actually, that was just a blip. That was a small seasonal change and came down immediately after. Then you have to go and change your transfer value again. It's not that, you always, of course, need to deliver the value to beneficiaries that they need to have, but you need to also consider how disruptive it is if you're changing a transfer value on a month-on-month basis up and down, and people don't necessarily understand why you're doing it. So yeah, always keep in mind both, let's say, a price trend increase and fluctuations, and build your changes of the transfer value on something that is actually an actual steady increase that is a trend, and not just a small variation in on a monthly dashboard of prices, if you will. And always make sure that you communicate this change to people in in a good way. So that's the change over time. Sorry, coming back to the change between regions. Again, I would always say the more you can monitor, the better. But you should also be aware that if you're seeing very, very big price differences between regions, be aware if that's reflecting a real difference in the cost of living, or if there's something else going on. Again, speaking from experience, I've seen MEBs where one base cereal has been used throughout a country, leading to vastly different price points of the basket in different regions, because this particular base cereal was wildly differently costed. And when that was kind of unpacked, it was because actually that base cereal was not consumed in one part of the country. So it wasn't really available in the market. So the price was actually super high because people didn't buy it, leading to a revision of the basket and then a much more sort of harmonized cost of the MEB across countries, and subsequently then also a much more harmonized transfer value. It's not to say that things can't cost differently across a country. Of course it can. And if that is really the case, and it reflects a reality, then I think you have a strong case for implementing different transfer values. That is just the data speaking. Then of course you have to consider things such as, could there be push-pull effects? Could it be perceived in a certain way that some get a higher transfer than others? And if you know, are people amenable to arguments such as, well, actually cost of living is much higher in the north than the south, or whatever that looks like. So again, like, I'm very fond of this. I'm not really giving anybody a recommendation, but I'm giving like sort of things to think about. And I think those, think about, you know, are your price changes both spatially and temporarily, are they actually reflecting a reality on the ground? If they are, then you can act on it. But when you act, make sure you communicate whatever it is that you're changing really, really well, both to whoever you're working with and particularly to your beneficiaries. I'm going to stop here because we still have much more on the program. So it's nice to see all these questions and we want to answer them all, but I think we need to leave it over to Max now.
Absolutely. So handing over to Max, I think one of the bottom line questions that was slightly raised by Marianne is, at the end of the day, how does all the work we do on MEB contribute to increase or improve the impact for end recipient? Because we are spending a lot of time in these technical processes, methodologies, and approaches, and going into very technical details. But we wanted to take a step back and to zoom out a bit to really understand what does it mean for the people we serve. And if the added value is not obvious, maybe a question we should ask is it worth the time, the cost, and everything? So Max, I'm handing over to you for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathalie. So maybe just to start off this conversation, Ground Truth Solutions is not really an organization that can speak very sort of technically to some of these complexities of calculating MEBs, of using them to adjust transfer values of CVA. We spend most of our time and predominantly work with and for people affected by humanitarian crises to ensure that their opinions, their perspectives inform the delivery of aid across different contexts. So to that end, we've spoken to thousands of people on the receiving end of all sorts of different CVA programs, all sorts of different in-kind programs as well, to essentially understand their experience of those programs and ultimately, in many ways, also their experience of some of the more technical discussions that we're also having here today. So based on our work on the cash barometer, which as Nathalie mentioned is an accountability mechanism for CVA that we work on, we know that, simply put, and very unsurprising to all of you, cash is preferred by most because it enables recipients to prioritize and meet their own basic needs, with the caveat of under the right circumstances. So in over 20,000 interviews across different contexts, we consistently find that cash recipients are more positive about their own ability to meet their basic needs than those receiving only in kind. And I think it's fair to say that this is also among the reasons why we, as a community of practitioners, why we favor CVA as an aid modality, because on principle, we believe that CVA, and again, under the right conditions, is a more dignified modality that increases both choice and ultimately value for recipients. I think if we're being honest, most of us will also accept that the premise that our own needs assessments, our own analyses can often be off, can often be incorrect or slow to reflect changing realities, while ultimately those of aid recipients' own assessments of their own priorities, their own needs, rarely are ultimately. And so from what we've heard today and in previous editions of this webinar series, we know that the MEB is obviously an important component in CVA in that it helps determine transfer values by defining what households require to meet their basic needs on a recurring or regular basis. And we've seen that obviously an understanding of people's expenditure priorities and their expenditure patterns, how those change over time, those are all crucial to that end. So the argument goes essentially, the more information we have, the more effectively we can ultimately respond to people's needs. Our conversations with cash recipients across different contexts, so all of our perceptual research, all of our qualitative work that we do, point to a similar finding in many contexts, which again, very simply put, is the more information CVA recipients have, the more effectively they can respond to their own needs. So for example, in our latest survey in Somalia, we found that the extent to which respondents feel informed about available aid was positively correlated to whether they feel that the aid they receive allows them to meet their basic needs. So again, the extent to which they are aware of available support, the more effective they feel the aid they receive allows them to cover their own needs. That same sort of correlation, that same effect was visible with respect to participation as well. So where respondents feel their opinions are being taken into account by aid providers, they also feel more able to meet their basic needs. In Nigeria, for example, when we first carried out our cash barometer survey in 2019, we found that almost 90% or so of respondents didn't know how aid providers, aid agencies decided who receives cash and who does not. So a common, often contentious issue about the extent to which to communicate targeting criteria, for example. A similar percentage also reported not knowing for how long they will be receiving CVA for, which again is not uncommon, especially in contexts obviously where that might not be so clear from the outset. So after communicating with the cash working group in Borno and other organizations there who committed to sort of more clearly and effectively communicating some of these aspects, we came back the year after, so this August, and we saw an important improvement on a lot of these fronts. So in addition to just the improved awareness of targeting criteria and the duration of CVA, respondents also showed an increase in their assessment of the fairness of programs. So do you feel aid goes to those who need it most? That was found to have increased as the awareness of those other features had increased. And here too, we saw that findings again show a positive correlation between participation and the ability to meet needs. Obviously, there's many reasons why respondents might feel more or less informed on certain aspects of targeting, the duration of assistance. But the point to us here is that where respondents feel informed, whether it's about what support systems are out there, what type of aid is available to them, whether they feel informed about targeting criteria, the duration of assistance, whether they can contribute to shaping that programming, they're typically more inclined to judge their experience of CVA positively, which means as much as CVA works better for them in those cases. So they find it more effective, as was the case in Somalia and in Nigeria, in terms of their ability to meet their basic needs, and they find it more fair, as is the case in Nigeria, where essentially their sense increased or correlates positively to whether aid goes to those who need it most. And basically in both cases, we find that more consultation and consideration of their views typically corresponds with an improved ability to meet needs. So if we take that argument and sort of flip it on its head, it tells us that where recipients are in the dark about programming and are not consulted about their preferences, this undermines some of the reasons why we collectively favor CVA under the right conditions. It undermines some of the reasons that I outlined above, basically. If recipients are in the dark about how long they receive CVA for, they naturally can't effectively plan for a future in which they're suddenly without it. Obviously, there's context in which, as I mentioned, that's difficult to predict, and the length or availability of funding might not be readily clear. But ensuring recipients are notified when their final transfers approach as early as possible arguably will go a long way in their ability to prioritize those needs going forward. Where CVA recipients or affected people in general are kept in the dark about how CVA is targeted, about how recipients are selected, those that do qualify and do receive CVA in whatever form sort of must blindly accept what is given to them without further explanation, and ultimately with little recourse, with few options, essentially, when problems do occur. Those that don't qualify ultimately don't understand why, and are left with a sort of reminder of the power disparities between aid providers and their recipients. But if criteria are understood and they are transparent, not only can recipients and non-recipients sort of more easily or more readily accept the decision-making behind that, but they can also more effectively and importantly hold CVA providers to account. In terms of what this means for MEBs and the effectiveness of adjusting transfer values, what this means in terms of the inordinate amount of work that goes into calculating these aspects and calibrating, is that I think it would be very interesting to start off with more effectively communicating some of these aspects, some of this thinking that goes into this back to recipients, to explain to them, for example, why and how these calculations were made, how assistance is targeted, how long for, and to effectively seek their input if we want to capitalize on the advantages that we all see, the potential that we all see in CVA and its ability to meet needs more effectively than alternative modalities of aid. Ultimately, I like this phrase a lot. It was in a recent CaLP blog. The promise of CVA is that it gives affected people choice, and in that allows a sort of shift from the role of aid agencies from providers of recovery to becoming the facilitators of recovery. I think most of our findings, most of our work really points to that to enable that shift, we will need a lot more regular communication between aid providers and recipients in a way that encourages their participation in those programs. So that's all from me, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Max. I think it was super helpful to help us technical people to take some step back and remember that not only all the technical stuff is important and do matters, but not to be stuck in that, because as you rightly mentioned, the communication can have almost equal impact on the use that beneficiaries can make of assistance as the transfer value itself. And as long as we are transparent and that we can justify and explain why we are giving what we are giving, it's better. And we know that I feel other MEB work, and this series is also demonstrating that it's very hard to find consensus over what is the good MEB in X or Y context. And we've seen it today again between the MEB and the MEB. It raises a lot of debate. So at the end of the day, it's to go for the good enough, the most consensual possible solution, to align with that, to be transparent, and to be able to really provide strong justification and explanation of why we are doing what we are doing the way we are doing it. There are further questions in the chat, many more questions. Some are still on price changes and how does that trigger the update of the MEB. So I encourage you to attend next week's webinar, which will be the final webinar of the series, that will be focused and dedicated on MEB update and review, and hopefully we'll touch on this price monitoring and how do price monitoring can trigger the update of the MEB. We have also many questions related still to the SMEB and the MEB, and one that is, I think, interesting because it's connected to what Max just shared. It's a thought-provoking question, as said, and it asks, should dignity be included in SMEB or not? Is it ethical to exclude what people would consider essential to their dignity? So I guess we don't really need to answer that question per se, because we would all want to provide assistance that would not only cover the basic needs, but in dignity. So the question that is left, that I take away from this debate, is why to do a SMEB at all? What is it really like adding? What is the fundamental difference with MEB? And how does it help us to assess what is the actual part of the needs that we are covering? And I think that this is something that's really important when we convert the MEB into the transfer value, is to have this gap analysis and all this gap analysis process in mind to understand where we are in terms of needs and what we are actually covering.
Can I add something here?
Sure, Nuna, go for it.
And it's just to kind of expand a bit on that. I think that's also a bit the point we started with, which is you have a threshold and you set a gap against that threshold. And when you then, if you manage to give people the entirety of that gap, you bring them up to that threshold. But we also were quite sort of, I think, frank that, of course, reality is also funding and targeting and all these other things that ends up with that transfer value sometimes being smaller. So just because we have chosen an MEB or an SMEB threshold, like, why not have the essential needs threshold and not a survival threshold? If you might not end up bringing people all the way up there, but you would be able to show a donor, you will be able to show Marianne how far away you are from that threshold. That is at least something like food for thought. Huh? And then maybe you have also calculated a survival minimum threshold, and maybe your transfer value looks more like a gap against that one. But if you have the MEB, you will also be able to show, actually, we are bringing people, like, here is the threshold. We're bringing people to here, and that is only around the survival threshold. And there's more to do if we wanted to bring people all the way up. That's another way to think about it. So I just wanted to put that there. Yeah, as well, because the MEB is not the transfer value and the gap is not necessarily either the transfer value. So
yeah, I want to take that question in the because there was a few questions also related to the harmonization of transfer value and how the MEB can help harmonizing, and it was slightly touched by Marianne. So Justina is asking, when using MEB for sectoral interventions and by organizations with sectoral mandate like WFP for food, how do we then bring across the message of the importance of harmonization of the transfer values to partners who do not have mandate limitations? So I think that really relates to what you were presenting, Nuna, at the beginning, is that program objective is the most important factor when you define your transfer value. And if you have sector-specific interventions, why to use the MEB? The MEB does not necessarily appear to be the most appropriate tool. Hopefully you would have sector-specific baskets, and the MEB should not be the sum of the sector-specific baskets.
But why not? So here is, so I would, my sort of, if I can be the devil's advocate a little bit on this, like one of my pet peeves here, is that we talk a lot about sector coordination when we do this, and the MEB for us is sort of the pinnacle of sector coordination. And we have to sort of take all these different needs into account and we bundle them all together. Okay, but that's fine. And you come up with a total sort of holistic total view of what people need. And then you base a transfer based on that. Then there's the other side that Marianne was also talking about, which is thinking in sectors instead and like partitioning transfers by sector. And then maybe you coordinate and say somebody gives this part of the MEB, and somebody else puts that on top and that on top and that on top. I would still always think that if you don't bring people up to a level where they can actually cover their essential needs or their basic needs, that whole coordination bit might not matter so much, because who's the very best at sector coordination? Well, it's not us, it's the households themselves. And if you give them an amount that's less than what they actually really in total need, they're going to do all the coordination in the world with that amount. They're going to put some of that to their food needs, they're going to put some of that to their education needs this month because they have to pay the school fees. Next month, it might be something else that they prioritize. That's sector coordination for you. And we can't sort of be the controllers of that. We shouldn't be the controllers of that. But I think we can definitely expect that if people don't have enough funds in their pockets to cover all of their needs, that's how it's going to go. And so for me, it's always been a little funny to think about partitioning out cash into these different buckets, because at the end of the day, that coordination will happen at the ground level, however we think about it or not. That's just a very sort of, that's just my devil's advocate comment on this. Sorry, back to you. I almost interrupted you. So excited.
That's really like, I guess in an ideal world, we would have like MPC and then top up for like sector specific needs that cannot be covered, that won't be prioritized. Or we also had the question of like groups with specific needs and so on. We know that MPC cannot cover everything, but you're absolutely right, Nynne. Like if basic needs are not covered, people will do what they can to have their priority needs covered anyway. So we have just a few minutes left and a whole bunch of questions. I'm turning to Rabeea, Max, and Marianne. Maybe if you have a reaction, something you want to add to what was said, to questions that were asked, and for all the questions that remain, please be sure that we'll address them through the next Q&A document that will be posted in CaLP website soon. Rabeea, do you want to go?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I do appreciate so much thinking process that has been generated through the presentation of SMEB versus MEB, which is very much interesting at the same time, because we had the similar debates over and over again when we were setting the SMEB itself. I am very much tempted to say something on that dignity part, because when we were debating on whether to include the sanitary napkins or not, there was the discussions around, because these are part of the dignity kits. And in Yemen and many other contexts, because I belong to South Asia, and I know that in many other contexts, women don't actually have access to the sanitary napkins. And what they do is they use cloth and they wash it and they reuse it, which is super, super unhygienic. And then to do so, they need water. And in Yemen, water is super expensive. If they cannot afford the water to drink, how can they afford the water to rewash the clothes they will use for the sanitary purposes? So there was a debate, and this is the reason we deemed this item as critical and included it in the list. So for us, it is a critical item. Including more dignity items or not, then again, it becomes a human right-based approach towards the MEB, and then it keeps on deviating towards the MEB arena rather than the survival minimum expenditure basket. So we had these debates. And then another question which I would just touch upon is that somebody asked about the harmonization of monitoring of SMEB. So for us, it is mentioned in the guidance note that we have a principal agreement, and we will be reaching out to REACH. REACH has already supported us in a whole lot of analysis for the commodity costs and things. So we will be using different sources of data, combining it, and then we'll be using the composite monitoring purposes. A step ahead in future, because we have recently established the SMEB, but in future we will be developing a monitoring framework, a formal monitoring framework for it, so that we can use it in a formal manner, and then the CV actors can utilize it further. So over from my side, and any further questions we'll answer in the question and answers part.
Thank you very much. Max, there was a question for you from Stefan Schmott, if you want to take it.
Sure, thank you. And maybe just briefly, I absolutely accept and appreciate that there's lots of messages that need to be communicated with recipients, be they on program details, hygiene, nutrition, as you outlined. But I think the point I'm making is a sort of more broader one, in the sense that the communication and the engagement with recipients that we're calling for is more than just something that needs to be communicated toward recipients. It's something that engages recipients in a discussion, and where approaches are based less on the preferences of recipients. Essentially, there'll be more to communicate, or turn it on its head, approaches that are based more on the input of recipients, the less sort of foreign and the less need for explanation there will be for some of the features that you introduce. So an example would be the use of mobile money, for example, in Iraq, that was introduced by humanitarian organizations, versus the sort of then progressive transition to using the QI card or the key card. Now, obviously, there's a lot of reasons that went into the decision to use mobile money, but the point I'm making is essentially that there is a lot to explain to recipients of a mobile money system if they've never used mobile money. If, on the other hand, they are consulted and sort of that assistance is provided in line with their preferences, that communication is a sort of two-way street that essentially reduces the need to explain certain things as much. Thanks.
Thank you very. Sorry, thank you very much, Max. Marianne, do you want to add one last comment?
Yes, actually, I've seen plenty of questions related to the intervention. I don't have much time, but maybe I can just revert back regarding the hybrid modalities and the emergency versus development assistance. So lots to say, but regarding the hybrid modalities, actually, we were confronted to several situations where a partner was willing to deliver an MPC, and due to the volatile context, due to insecurity, to let's say a new sudden shock within this emergency situation, the partners quickly realized that MPC was not the most appropriate modality, and that they still had to use the MEB, but by using different modalities, like parts of the assistance that would be delivered through physical cash, and another part through voucher. This is actually very often used for sectoral assistance, but not only, and they also had to do a pipeline of in-kind to cover needs that were not anymore available on markets, for example. The problem with this is that when you are trying to use several modalities, you need also to multiply your, let's say, resources in terms of teams, in terms of pipeline, in terms of relation with financial service provider, etc., which makes that in the end, instead of on having a very, let's say, simplified action with just one modality, it's like if you had to deliver like 3 different projects to the same recipients. So very often it was too complicated for the partners to deliver this mixed modality, and they had to review the intervention to make it simpler, faster, and and revising the priority and the essential needs that they had to cover in comparison to what was planned in the beginning. When I was talking about the fact that emergency assistance was not able to cover the depth of the gap, this is related to many different things, and maybe the simple one would be the fact that the emergency assistance is very short term, and the duration of it is most of the time quite short, while the gaps may be sustained, and also the level of it. We may respond to some gaps by the provision of cash, while some other needs would not be covered just by the provision of cash. It means that most of the time we must combine like a cash intervention with some complementary intervention, for example, to improve the access to some services or the provision of something because it would require I don't know, technical support or something like that. And yeah, so this is one point. And then regarding the duration, just because I was talking too fast. So for example, your intervention is going to last for 6 months, while the gaps will be, well, will remain after this intervention. And we definitely know that the population we are reaching will not be enabled to sustain a capacity to cover the needs without further assistance. And this is here that we are also trying to link, for example, the emergency assistance with the social protection mechanisms. So this is really to make it short, but I would require much more time to go in detail. And in any case, as said by Nathalie and Nynne, we will try to at least provide some further responses to all the detailed questions that have been raised during the call.
Thank you very much, Marianne. We've been running a bit beyond the planned time, but it's no surprise. We knew that we had a lot of questions, and as just repeated by Marianne, we'll have more details, more explanations coming in the Q&A document. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today. Rendezvous next week for the last webinar of the series. Given the high interest, we may have to organize further series, but for now, we'll stop with the next week's one. Thank you to all our panelists today, Max, Rabeea, and Marianne. It was a pleasure to have you, and as usual. So see you next week. Next week will be on update of the MEB, what triggers the revision of the MEB with a few examples. So please sign up on CaLP's website, and we'll be sharing again the link when we'll share the Q&A and recording of this one. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.